Resume the recording. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Building Inclusive Organizational Cultures, a River Network case study. We are going to go ahead and get started even as folks are arriving into the conference. We are expecting quite a large crowd today. And so we are going to have some interactive components, but no worries, no stress. I hope I made it clear in the reminder emails. There will be no breakout rooms. So please stay on. And instead, we're going to do interactive components using Menti and the chat box. So as always, if you have questions, if you need help with anything, Sandra will be monitoring the chat box. But otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. For those that are just joining, there is an intentional question, something that I want you to sit with, hopefully just to cleanse your palate as we enter into this presentation. Keep in mind that this conversation can bring up some uncomfortable emotions, physical reactions. I'm going to ask for the next 59.5 minutes that you try to be as comfortable physically as you possibly can by having your feet on the ground, good posture, have some water or tea or whatever you find comforting next to you, and really try to be present during this conversation. This conversation will be recorded and available through the CDR YouTube page following this recording or this session. So as I mentioned, this is Building an Inclusive Organizational Culture, a River Network case study, and this training is provided by the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed. Sandra, I didn't know if you wanted to say something real quick.
Yeah, I just want to really welcome everyone. I know that, a lot of folks in the room and beyond are trying to work on their own equity journey in the personal respect and also within their organization, whether it be trainings, working with a consultant, and having these conversations with your staff. And I'm really encouraged to see such a great group today. And I hope you all share this too once it's over and continue the dialogue. And we're in good hands with Brenna. So Brenna, I'll turn it over back to you.
Thanks, Sandra. This is an opportunity for the journey to get started or even to provide some reflection if you already have started on this journey. I do want to review really quickly what I'm hoping that you'll get out of today's presentation and also what this presentation is not. So first and foremost, I want to say that this presentation is not meant to be a diversity, equity, and inclusion training presentation. River Network, we are not certified, we are not considered a DEI consultant in the traditional sense as of yet. However, we have gone through this journey and we are actively working on becoming an inclusive organization. And we have found in the environmental realm, especially, that being as transparent and open about our own journeys can encourage others to either begin or continue working on their own. We also have found that you cannot talk about inclusive cultures unless you're also talking about diversity and equity. So as I'm going through River Network's journey, you will see that I will be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion because inclusion is our ultimate goal. But there is a lot of steps that you have to go and before you get there. I also want to emphasize that this journey is going to look very different for each organization. The journey that River Network has gone on is not the same as what other organizations have experienced. It's not our journey, our work will not look necessarily the same as yours. And the groups that are on this call today, their journeys also might look very different, and that's okay. This is not a one-size-fits-all step-by-step process. You're going to have to meet people where they are and recognize that building towards an inclusive organizational culture is continuous. It is never ending. You can't just hit the pause button or stop or think that you've reached the summit of the mountain. That's just not how that goes. But hopefully after today's conversation, you will have an idea of what it takes to become a more inclusive culture and appreciate the work and time that you'll need to dedicate towards that. I would be remiss if I did not ask that we all take a minute in the chat box to introduce ourselves. So good afternoon. My name is Brenna Goggin. I'm the Mid-Atlantic Leadership Development Manager for River Network. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am on Lenni Lenape and Nanticoke lands traditionally. Because we have such a large group, I'm going to ask that people put in the chat box their name, pronouns if you want to share them, the organization that you're joining from today, and the lands that you're occupying. If you're not sure whose lands you're occupying, there is a website that's on this slide that will, if you put your address in, provide you with that information. This is just a way for us to get to know who's on the call today, and hopefully for you all to recognize where folks you can reach out to if you need opportunities to talk about this work more. So feel free to blow up the chat box by sharing your introductions. And I'm going to keep going. So all this work and any work when you're talking about organizational development should really be centered in a why. Why do you want to work on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Why do you want to build a more inclusive organization? And ultimately, I believe that staff and executive directors, managers, whatever your role may be with the organization, you want your team and your colleagues to feel safe, feel as if they can bring their true and authentic selves to the organization and the work, and that they matter and they are important and they have value. And so I encourage you, even though this is going to be recorded and will be shared with you, to write down these questions because these are great questions to sit with individually, but they're also questions that I would encourage you to bring back to your teams, whatever that may look like, whether you're looking at teams made up of colleagues, departments and department heads, a leadership team, your board of directors, what have you. These are questions that can get the conversation started and really get you down to your why, and also determine what part of the process of this journey will you need to focus on more. Do you need to do some more introductory work, or is that pretty well handled and you really need to start doing the more deeper dive where feelings are taken into account? So asking yourselves these questions can be really helpful, and they're good questions for building trust and open communication within your team. Two important aspects of building an inclusive culture. So step one of building an inclusive culture is building a shared language. And you are incredibly lucky in that the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed provided a diversity, equity, and inclusion toolkit for internal work. And so these definitions are pulled directly from that toolkit. And as part of building an inclusive culture, having an agreed upon share of definitions of this is what diversity means for us and for the organization. This is what equity means for us and the organization, and inclusive is an important process to start to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Any part of building an inclusive culture means that you have to recognize that diversity and equity are just as important to getting to the inclusive culture. You cannot have an inclusive culture unless you have diversity and equity. One does simply not exist without the other. And as I mentioned, today's presentation will focus on the inclusive part of the organization, but again, we'll include some diversity and equity work that River Network has done to get to the inclusive part. Probably the biggest elephant in the room to building a more inclusive culture and what organizations will have to work the hardest and most intentional about is addressing white dominant or white supremacy culture. And so what do I mean when I talk about white dominant or white supremacy culture? And you will see this terminology shows up interchangeably. So white supremacy and white dominant organizations have a preference of which one they use over others. But it's important to recognize that all of us are in white dominant culture. It is the systems by which we have all been educated to operate in. It is around us in all aspects. I heard Brene Brown equate it to it is the sea that we are all swimming in. It's not the shark that we all think it is. And it really is the sea that's all around us. And that is very true. So if you recognize, and to a certain extent accept, that white dominant culture shows up in your organization, that's the first step, is at least recognizing that that is the case, and that that's going to be your largest impediment to becoming an inclusive culture. And why is that? Well, because the traits that are associated and defined, as you can see on the screen, by white dominant or white supremacy culture are around keeping the systems in play for those that have power to keep it. And so the idea of building a more inclusive culture is that there's more power sharing, there's more transparency, there's more of a and both way of thinking as opposed to an either or thinking. We start dismantling and questioning the idea that success means that we're getting bigger and making more money, and that we have this focus on it's all about the numbers. And as long as we can track by the numbers, we're doing great. And also this sense of urgency that we all seem to live under. So today's presentation will be about how River Network kind of came to the conclusion that we also were swimming in the sea of white dominant culture and how we are actively working to dismantle that. But in order to understand how you can begin in building an inclusive culture, you need to understand how this work all plays with one another. So let's talk about the levels of influence or the theory of change. So the theory of change basically says that in order for change to truly happen, it has to happen at every level. And in this case, we are looking at the individual personal level. So that's us as individuals. Group and interpersonal can be your department, your division, your team, in whatever form that may look like. The systems and the organization is another level. And then finally, you have the community. And actually, River Network added the community level because we are a network. And so we are made up of organizations in addition to being our own entity. And I thought this resonated really well with the coalition. Because although you all are individual organizations, you all are also choosing to be part of the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed or Choose Clean Water or any other kind of collective entity. And that also has its own culture and its own way of operating. And so when you're looking at building a more inclusive culture, you have to be looking at building it at each and every single one of these levels. Now, the traditional thought is that it really needs to start with the individual and with the person, and then you begin working your way out. And when it comes to diversity and microaggressions and biases and what have you, yes, it's really critical that you begin at the individual level so that all the individuals of the same team and of the same organization are all coming from the same starting line. But in our case of River Network, we didn't quite follow that same roadmap. We really started at the community level and step by step, sometimes went down to the organizational, sometimes it went to the group. So it was specific departments within River Network. And then other times there were individuals doing that work and bringing it back out into the network. So you have these arrows on the screen to reflect that this work can come from originate from a different place, and the work can drive to different aspects of this the entities. So it can come from the community down to the individual, or the individual up to the organization, and then up to the community. So as you're looking at this, the way to think about it is you as the individual that have shown up today would be the triangle, whatever team you work in. I'm in the leadership development team or River Programs team at River Network. And so that's my team. I work for River Network, which is the organization, and then River Network, especially at River Rally, would be that community. And so a couple of examples that you're going to hear in my explanation of River Network's journey is how we really focused at River Rally. That's where we were most intentional in the very beginning, and how the lessons from River Rally and from the community really trickled down into the organization and individual level. So I wanted to point that out and remind you from the beginning when I said that this journey is going to look different for every organization. It even looked different for us from what the books and the consultants and the advice that we were given. But we learned a lot that way. So when we're talking about organizational culture, we have to recognize that organizational culture is made up of both individuals and the organization itself. When the organization was established or founded, it then created by its very entity and being incorporated its own culture. There was an idea that sparked creating this organization. There were individuals that founded or worked together to found that organization, and they had their own belief systems and their own set of ways of doing things, their own histories that they brought into the organization. And so recognizing that when you're talking about building on inclusivity, you have to address both the individual and the organizational culture, whether you were part of that founding or not. And recognizing that individuals, every single one of them, your staff, your board members, your volunteers, they all come with their own history. They all come with their own fears, their own levels of exposure, their own lived or learned histories and traumas, and their own education. And so that's why starting with a shared language and agreed upon, these are the definitions by which we are going to operate under, and making that part of your foundation is so important, because at least then you're all using the same language as you do this work together. And recognizing that some individuals are going to be further along in the process than others, and trying to meet those that are at the start line where they are, and bring them up to the rest of the staff's level. And again, recognizing that part of the organizational culture has really been defined by white dominant or white supremacy culture, and that is going to take some intention, a lot of intention and time to address and change, and that you're not alone. Keeping in mind, again, this work does not stop, it's never ending, and it is going to be balancing. There are going to be times where you're going to be focused more on the individual than you are the organization, and vice versa, and that's okay. Again, this is not a one size fits all. Everyone must follow this roadmap and then follow the same directions. It's really about where you want to end up. So we are going to do an exercise that is anonymous. And on your screen, and Sandra, if you can put this in the chat box, we're going to use menti.com. And if you log on to menti.com and you enter the code, which is 65229280, you should have a question that comes up on your screen and you should be able to answer it. And the question is, how does white dominant culture show up in your organization? And if you need a reminder of what makes up white dominant culture, I can read those traits back to you. But let's take a minute to have people sign on. Hopefully you're able to do so easily. And as you, in this case, you can select as many as you want. And they are listed at the bottom, but I do know, because we have so many attributes of white supremacy culture that the wording is a little tiny. So if you could indicate where it shows up in your organization, and choose whatever options you are, it should automatically show up on the screen as people are submitting those options. So you have perfectionism. There's no room for error. Nope, you can submit as many as you want. Oh, you should be able to submit. I did it this morning and it said that you could select, I selected all of them and it worked just fine. If you have trouble, okay, it says that you can only select one. I apologize, not sure how that happened. And the other one is, there is a question about for you. That should be the next one. That should be the next question that we're gonna work under. So pick the one that maybe is most prominent. Oh, Laura says that you can choose more than one on your phone, but not showing up on the screen. Well, that's really interesting. Well, apologies for the technical difficulties that we seem to be experiencing. That's what I get for trying to use something new and fancy. Oh, Eva says that she refreshed the page to submit more, if that helps. So it should be, as people are putting in that information, it'll show up on the screen. I'm just gonna move forward the slide and see if that actually works. Oh, let's go back. Let me. So the responses are not showing up on the screen the way that also was practiced. Not sure what's going on there. But let me see if I can bring it up on my computer. That way you can see the results of what people are indicating.
Brenna, Abby is saying that it's fixed now. It says you changed the screen.
How did I change the screen?
Minty has a mind of its own.
It does. Minty's like, no, I'm sorry, you're just not going to work today. Even though I practiced and it all worked out. So let me see if, please wait for the presenter to show the next slide. Well, I don't want to show the next slide. I want to show this slide. Look, how does white dominant culture show up in you? Showed up. Yay, this is what I was supposed to do. I'm not quite sure what happened there. I appreciate the patience as we figured it out. So let's talk about how white dominant culture shows up in you as an individual. Not surprising, perfectionism and sense of urgency seem to be the top contenders. We hear that most often, and I do know that me personally, those are the two that show up for me in just about every exercise that I do. So thank you for sharing those. Let's see if the white dominant culture in the organization doesn't seem to want to play, but I will get the results from Metameter after this, and I will take a screenshot so that you can help it show up. And I appreciate the encouragement from those that were like, it's still a good exercise, even if it doesn't work. Thank you. You're very kind. So let's start diving into how River Network and how this has shown up at River Network. So River Network, like I said, started at the organizational and the community level and focused primarily on the diversity aspect. So we centered diversity as from the DEI perspective, we made diversity our primary focus. And so as such, we set certain goals for what we wanted to accomplish. So in 2005, we elected our first female and person of color board chair in the organization's, at that point, 25+ year history. And through her leadership and work, started creating some goals and metrics related to River Rally. So for those that are not familiar with River Network, we have an annual event, River Rally, where organizations, it's basically our forum that takes place in May. And so in 2011, we really began centering the EDI work at Rally, making sure that we had space for organizations that were led by women or people of color, that we had speakers that made up women, people of color, members of the LGBTQ community, and we were being very intentional in our recruitment efforts around those presenters and speakers, as well as making sure that we were introducing the idea of why organizations should be doing DEI work, and making that a focus of River Rally discussions. And then in 2014, the board decided that the EDI work really needs to come up to the board level, that we need to move from the community, since that we started in 2011 with River Rally, and really start bringing this into the organization. And the way that we were going to do that is at the board level. And so the board created a diversity subcommittee that was part of the governance committee, and made building diversity into River Network one of its key priorities over the next 2 years. And then that led to it being a center point of River Network's strategic plan. So I mentioned we started at the community level with River Rally. We started bringing it in to the organization at the board level. And the problem with that is that we lost sight of the community. So where it had started, we were like, oh, we're good. We've set aside places for speakers and organizations, and making sure that we're being intentional with our scholarship use, and really had River Rally where we thought to be a good place. So we started working more at the organizational level. And that caused us to have our first very public learning moment, when in 2018, River Network held a rally, our annual River Rally, at a location with a very derogatory name towards Indigenous communities. And although it had been discussed prior to the hosting of Rally, our conferences are decided many years in advance. And so it was just an unfortunate circumstance that we did not take the steps needed to cancel that contract and move River Rally to a different location. And as such, we had attendees during River Rally itself circulate a petition that criticized the staff and the board of River Network for choosing such a negative, derogatory, disrespectful location to hold our River Rally. And our River Heroes, which are our annual awards program, stood in solidarity with those that were circulating that petition, and called on River Network to make a very public apology and really delve into this work more down at the staff level and at a deeper level. And it was, I know, even though I was not part of River Network at the time, a critical turning point for the organization. It was the first time through this DEI journey that we had hit a very public stumbling block. And to learn publicly provides a lot of valuable insight. Yes, it is incredibly uncomfortable at the time, and can be hurtful for both sides, but it also provided us with an opportunity to reflect, to hear from our community, to engage them in a dialogue, and to make promises to hold ourselves accountable to do better and to be better. While the community appreciated those responses, the Rightfully so, the anger and the disappointment did carry over into 2019, where our board chair once again recognized and apologized for the choices that we had made in 2018. And again, we held space at that rally at the request of both staff and the attendees to talk about what went wrong, and allow members of our community to express their anger or their sadness or their disappointment, or whatever emotion it elicited, to River Network. And we took note of that. And it is something that was written down, and it's something that is shared with staff. And I go back to for those that joined us at the very beginning of that presentation, the question was, have you ever been left out of an event or a meeting or a party, whether it's professionally or personally? Have you been left out of something, not invited? Or if you were invited, regulated to the wall seating as opposed to sitting at the table? Or in my case, I'm usually regulated to whatever pet may be in the house as opposed to talking to actual people. But reflect on how that felt, the physical reactions that you felt by not being included, the emotional or mental toll that took. What was the story that you were telling yourself at that time? That was what was being expressed to us in relation to the choices that were made in 2018. And all of those were written down, and they have been shared with staff. And what's so valuable to that is that it's a reminder that we have all at one point in time in our lives been left out or have not felt included. And River Network wanted to make sure that there was no member of our community that felt that way moving forward. And so we knew that we had to double down and be more intentional in our work to ensure that at every level of the organization, individual, organization, and community, that we were as inclusive and welcoming as possible to any person that wanted to be part of our work. So as such, we really started moving to the internal. Some of this work had started to take place before 2018 occurred, but that provided a new incentive and driver for us to prioritize this. And so as part of our strategic plan, we developed a why statement, recognizing that water, which is our main focus, is not equitable. Folks, not everyone has access to clean drinking water. Not everyone has access to waterways, and the outdoors in general are not necessarily a welcoming place. And so we developed this why statement to build on and to create our foundation of how and why River Network will operate the way that it will, both internally and externally. What this did is it made it very clear to the board and to the staff as to why we were doing this work, and really started laying the roadmap for how we were going to get to being the best river network, the most inclusive river network, the most equitable river network, and diverse river network we could be. And we're still working. I don't want anyone to think that we have made it to the finish line. There is no finish line. We are still working on that policy or that process. So after we developed our why statement, we started making sure that all members of the River Network staff and board were trained in EDI, and that's where we brought in a consultant. So we recognized that we needed to have a consultant help with facilitated conversations, and it mostly at that point was at the board level and around the strategic plan. But it began the foundational work. So similar to how we started today's presentation of what is diversity, equity, and inclusion, that was also what is diversity, equity, inclusion look like for River Network? What does belonging look like? And so we then did some trainings that are still available on our website, going into what is DEI and how can you begin incorporating that work into your organization. And then in 2019 and 2020, we brought in another consultant to help us do that more internal work. So as we were going through this process of looking at what happened in 2018 and our response to that, the work that we were doing related to the individual staff members in 2018 resulted in a lot of staff turnover prior to the pandemic. And a part of that was staff certainly had new opportunities that they wanted to capitalize on, as they should. And we're really supportive of that. But there was also individuals that didn't feel as if River Network was moving fast enough. Some individuals felt that River Network was moving too fast and they couldn't commit to it. But that why statement that we created and the board and the staff's dedication to this is what provided that true north. And it became understood that this is the direction that River Network is going in. And we're going to help you get there if you want. And if not, then we respect your decision to walk away. But that level of turnover also caused a lot of disruption. So it disrupted the organization's culture. When you have such a substantial turnover as we experienced over the course of 18 months, it meant that we really were taking a step back and going, wait, what are the real issues here at River Network? It's bigger than just holding a rally at a location that we shouldn't have held rally at. It's bigger than just us talking about holding places at rally and within our staff for women or people of color or LGBTQ members of the community. It's bigger than that. What does that then look like? And so through that exploration within ourselves, we discovered that we suffer at River Network from white dominant culture. And we didn't know how to dismantle that within the organization. We had ideas, but we also have full-time jobs. And so River Network brought in the Avarna group to help us figure out, one, to see where white dominant culture was showing up within the entire organization, and two, how could we actively begin dismantling that? And so while we were doing that, we also learned that we had to operationalize several practices to make sure that the organization was as welcoming and as inclusive as it possibly could be. So we updated our policies and procedures and our hiring practices. We built in greater transparency into our hiring and our salary and our onboarding process, and had some very difficult conversations about what it would take to make sure that all staff are equitable. So what did Avarna show us? So going back to the earlier part where we had the white dominant culture listed on the slide of how that shows up. Outside of the circle that's on your screen, that is how white dominant culture showed up in River Network. And if you're doing the math, you will see that just about every aspect of white dominant culture that was listed at the beginning showed up at River Network. And some of us were surprised, some of us were not surprised. It was one of those, well, sure, I guess we knew, but we didn't know until we had someone come in and really hold that mirror up to us. And so how do you begin dismantling this? How do you address it? What are the antidotes to white dominant culture? And that was probably the most valuable experience that having a consultant helped us, was really doing the work, helping us to identify the tools that we would need to level by level begin dismantling this throughout the organization. And so in order to get over the idea of defensiveness and perfectionism, we built our own group agreements by which staff operates. So every staff meeting, we read out our group agreements that we created together, and we're actually adding 2 more group agreements to our next staff meeting because we've recognized that some other attributes have started to show up that we need to address. But part of our group agreements is the ouch, oops, and redo. And this was one when we were working with the consultant. We had since I started at River Network in 2019, but we weren't actually using it. And the reason we asked ourselves, why aren't we using it? And it's difficult to call people out. There's fear associated with calling people out, especially if people that you are calling out or calling in are at a different level of the organization than you are. And so this was one that we have practiced over and over and over again. If someone says something that they recognize was inappropriate or could be and is hurtful, they have the opportunity to reach out to the staff that they may have hurt to say, I'm really sorry, can I have a redo, please? I recognize that what I said could have been hurtful. Likewise, the staff that was hurt is encouraged to call that person in and explain like what they heard when that person said what they said. And it opens up an opportunity for conversation around the use of language, the use of tone, in a way that didn't exist previously. And it's all an even playing field. It doesn't matter if I call in our executive director or if an associate calls in the executive director or vice versa. We are all equals in this work. We also the staff created its own EDI committee. So while the board had its work, we recognized that at the staff level, we needed our own space. We needed our space to learn, and through the EDI committee, affinity groups were created for the staff members on our team that identify as people of color. They have opportunities to meet themselves and talk about whatever issues they want to talk about, whether it's a formal or informal conversation. They have their own space. There has been conversations amongst the white members of our team of whether we should have an affinity space, a place where we can ask questions, where we are calling on ourselves as white folks to get educated and learn and teach each other, rather than having that onerous fall on the members of staff that identify as people of color. Our monthly staff meetings now are on a rotating basis of who gets to facilitate. You sign up and you get a co-facilitator that signs up with you, and you determine the agenda of the staff meetings. And every person on the organization, regardless of level, can ask for a certain amount of time on the staff meeting agenda. And we have blocks of time that are for general updates versus a deep dive conversation. And that deep dive conversation usually involves breakout rooms and fixing an issue of some sort. So our last staff meeting, we focused on our toolkits. It's a tool that River Network uses to educate our community on work that we have found to be helpful, but we wanted to analyze it. Were these toolkits still helpful? What purpose are they serving? How can we do them better? And so it was a 45-minute part of our staff meeting that was facilitated by the 2 facilitators in each breakout room. And we came up with so many good ideas that we didn't otherwise or wouldn't otherwise have had an opportunity to discuss. Now, I should also note, for those that are not familiar, River Network is an all virtual team, all remote team, regardless of a pandemic. So the way that we operate has always looked different from many of our other organizations that have offices. But now that we are all pretty much operating in the virtual space, these should carry over relatively well. The Avarna group, which is on the screen, it was the consultant that we used. They helped us to build in a feedback culture. So breaking down that defensiveness, if we had feedback for staff, we would have opportunities to share that feedback and it would be encouraged. There's no penalization for providing feedback. Our executive director is a big believer in sharing information. And so one of the things that we were working on was the handbook for the organization and what vacation days and holidays we were going to recognize and how we were going to block other days off of our calendar to be respectful of holidays that we didn't recognize with time off. And she missed one when she sent around the handbook. And so several of us at one time were all like, oh, what about this day? And she came right back and was like, yes, like, thank you for catching that. What else did I miss? Whereas, as we all know through email, when you're getting bombarded by 17 staff members going, well, what about this holiday? It could be really easy to get frustrated or get your back up and go, I know the first 3 people told me. And that's just not the way that we operate. She recognizes and asks for feedback quite frequently on issues all over to make sure that we're holding her accountable as the face of the organization, but that it's also okay for her to hold us accountable as well in the moment. And that's an important distinction, holding people accountable in the moment, as opposed to waiting 9 months for it to show up on an evaluation form. That is not something that we recommend. Another group agreement that we have really used to combat that defensiveness is assuming positive intent. So we ask questions, we come in with curiosity as opposed to preconceived notions. And so if we're having a conversation, especially within the EDI committee, and someone says something, it's not unreasonable to hear someone go, well, what I heard was, is that what you meant? And oftentimes allows the speaker to sit for a minute, reflect on what they said or how they said it, and come back and explain themselves, or give them an opportunity to set the record straight. We've also started doing Radical Candor. That's a book by Kim Scott. It was an all staff read, and we have been practicing that within the staff. And the way that we start the conversation or start any type of radical candor is we say, can we have a minute to do a radical candor? So that way, whoever's on the other end of that knows, okay, this is an opportunity for me to learn, this is an opportunity for me to do better, or this is an opportunity to hear something that I needed to hear that I wasn't aware of. And so it just changes that mindset that folks recognize is it's a positive thing. We all want everyone at River Network to succeed, and we want to be a welcoming community. And at some point in time, something that we said or something that we did is not going to fulfill that goal. And we want our staff and our board and our network to be able to call us on it and use that as a learning opportunity to how we could do better. I want to emphasize again, we are still in the process of this work. We have created a culture subcommittee within River Network to continue the work that we did with the Avarna group. So our contract with the Avarna group ended earlier this month. And while it was there were a lot of tears, a lot of not being on video to be able to process what we were hearing. We also recognize that during one of the most difficult times in our country and in the world, we were able to cry together, we were able to laugh together, we were able to ask questions of one another, and we were able to grow in our relationships. For several of our staff, they had never met and still have never met other staff members because they were hired either right before the pandemic or in the middle of the pandemic, but we have a relationship that we wouldn't otherwise have. And we want to continue that work. And so the culture subcommittee is separate from the EDI committee because we don't want to mix the two. The EDI committee will continue. There's overlap between the EDI committee and the culture subcommittee, but the culture subcommittee is to really make sure that the lessons that we learned about white dominant culture and dismantling that white dominant culture continue, and that we are able to continue to hold ourselves accountable for that. So as I want to make sure that I leave time for any questions that folks may have, and feel free to, as I said, I know it's a sensitive topic. So if you have questions that you want to direct message me, I will not say who sent me those questions, but I will share the question with the group just so that I can share the answer as well. But the key takeaways from our own work is that don't get caught up in the perfection. That is an easy thing to do. Or for this matter, don't get caught up in the numbers, the data. You are going to make mistakes, and some of them might be public mistakes, but don't allow that fear to prevent you from doing this necessary work. Be intentional and be collaborative, and hold yourselves and each other accountable, and be as transparent as you possibly can. Going back to the slides where I was asking you to write down your why, keep that somewhere prominent, whether it's in your calendar invites when you meet as a team or as a staff, or when we are able to be back in person, it's on a whiteboard that everyone can see at all times. That keeps you centered, and will remind you when and if you get frustrated and want to walk away, why you made those agreements to begin with. This process is not linear, and you will fluctuate back and forth between the community, the organizational, and the individual. It's not a one size fits all. Every organization is going to have a different journey and a different process, and that is okay. And I also want you, first and foremost, to reflect on that. What did it feel like to you to be excluded or not included from a meeting or an event or a party? And that should be maybe part of your why, is that you want to make sure that no person that is affiliated with your organization or your work is ever made to feel that way. And if that's what your why is, then at least that gives you a starting point to build from. But I just want to provide opportunity if folks feel comfortable to come off camera and off of mute and want to ask questions, feel free. If not, feel free to also send them to me in my chat box. Some things. So I got a question in the chat about, and I'll go back to that slide, about, are there some things that are some aspects of white dominant culture that are helpful? Oh, look, hey, how white dominant culture shows up in your organization. The slide works. So sorry, it's colorful, but if you wanted to see that slide. So the other pieces of white dominant culture that maybe you should keep. And I don't want to, the way that I am going to answer that question is to ask another question, and that is, for what purpose? So what is it about any of these aspects of white dominant culture that you feel, or the organization feels, are really important to you that we have to keep, and why? Go back to that why. Even though it is white dominant or white supremacy culture, there are aspects of this that may just seem like they work for us. That's an organizational and individual conversation to have. What doesn't work for us? So when you look at the slides of how does, for instance, How does white dominant culture show up in organizations and in individuals? Urgency being one of them, right? Where we have to be on 24/7. That was something that River Network made #1 priority, very clear from the board and the executive director that we wanted to combat. So working all the time, working on weekends, working on your off time, that is not held up as a gold standard. In fact, you were called in on that. What is on your list that is requiring you to put in so many hours? Because that's not how we want to operate at River Network. And so there is not this immediate response that you have to, people are looking at their Outlook, and if you haven't responded in 5 minutes of your email, someone thinks that something is wrong. That is not a culture at River Network. And so that is something that we recognize we did not want to have, and we did not want to experience, and we did not want to encourage. And so every organization is going to have to make that choice as to how this works or does not work for them and their organization. So I got a question about how we practice the group agreements, and like some organizations have them, but sometimes we forget to use them. Yeah, we did that too. We created these wonderful group agreements on these white sheets of paper prior to the pandemic, and we had them hanging in the Boulder office. The problem is that 5 people work out of the Boulder office out of a 20-person staff. The rest of them work out of their homes. And so we didn't see those group agreements every time we came into the office, nor did we see them at the beginning of the meeting. And so actually, one of the things that the Avarna group recommended is that the group agreements be on the calendar invite that goes out for every staff meeting, or, and I mentioned that I'm part of the River Programs team. The River Programs team has those group agreements in their calendar invite, as does the EDI committee. And then we pick one of those things, one of the group agreements, and I think right now we have 9, that becomes kind of the star of the staff meeting. So what is the one that we are really going to practice from this staff meeting on before the next staff meeting? And how is that going to show up? And then we build time into the staff meeting to go, hey, how did you use that group agreement? The oops, ouch, and redo, like I said, that was the toughest one, and the one that we are still practicing. So I don't really have a lot of quote unquote data to tell you how that has worked, but the 2 new group agreements that we are talking about adding to our list are going to come from the EDI committee. So we use the EDI committee as our sounding board and our filter to see if we are on the right path. Does this send the message that we want it to send? I am the chair, I'm the co-chair of the EDI committee. And so almost all aspects of organizational culture come through the EDI committee in one way or another. So I hope that's helpful to modeling how we use the group agreements within the organization and keep those front and center. We also have the group agreements added into our agendas. So like I said, every staff member has an opportunity to facilitate, co-facilitate staff meetings. And as such, they build the agenda, and the group agreements are at the top of those agendas. And we're all looking at the agenda as we're going through the meeting. So those group agreements are also highlighted there. I think I have answered the questions that have come in directly to me. I really appreciate the opportunities that you provided to be vulnerable in sharing your questions with me. I hope that I've done a good job of answering them. You will get a copy of the slides and the recordings at the end. In addition to the takeaways, I've also included a list of resources that River Network has used, as well as resources from entities that I incorporated into this presentation. So you have 2 pages of resources to pull from. And then just on a flip side, as we end, because I always like ending on a positive note, I want you to take the opportunity to reflect on the time where you were included, where you were invited in. How did that make you feel? What physical reactions or emotional reactions did you feel? And set some intention from today. How are you going to take what you've learned today and incorporate it into your work, or incorporate it into the work of the organization? And how do you think that your organization could begin building a more inclusive culture? And then I know Sandra has shared the eval, but it's really important to us and our funders, and I know you all understand that, to have evaluation data. So if you could please share your thoughts about today's presentation, I would really appreciate it. I thank you so very much, and I encourage you all to share your journey and your story in this process so that we are all working on this together and beginning building in transparency. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.